They were still digging when the first rounds came in. Not sporadic. Not probing. Sustained. PKM machine gun fire from the tree line, less than 300 meters out, cutting across the half-built perimeter like a saw through unfinished wood. Dirt walls barely waist-high. Fighting positions not yet reinforced. Concertina wires still coiled in pallets. It was morning, but the valley held the cold of the night. Thin air. Steep slopes. No cover except what they had failed to finish. The outpost wasn't ready. The men knew it. Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade had been on the ground for less than 24 hours. Vehicle Patrol Base Kahler was supposed to become a permanent presence. A statement. A foothold in the Waygal Valley. Instead, it was a bowl. High ground on all sides. Tree lines above them. Compounds overlooking their positions. And someone else had already calculated the geometry. The first RPG struck near the command post. Then another. Then 3 more, staggered, walking inward. The radio net fractured immediately. Troops in contact wasn't a report. It was a constant state. Staff Sergeant Ty Carter was moving between positions, returning fire with his M4, dragging ammunition across open ground that had already been zeroed in. Specialist Stefan Mace was hit early. Others followed. There was no front line. The enemy was everywhere. Taliban fighters, estimated at over 150, coordinated, disciplined, moving along pre-rehearsed routes. They weren't guessing. They knew the dead space. They knew the blind angles. They knew exactly where the Americans hadn't finished digging. Mortar rounds began to land. Not accurate at first. Then they adjusted. They always adjusted. A 60mm tube from the U.S. side tried to respond, but the firing pit had limited defilade. Each round risked exposing the crew further. Above them, the slopes were alive. Observers. Spotters. Men with radios. This wasn't an ambush. It was a scheduled event. Requests for close air support were already moving up the chain, from platoon level to company command, then relayed through battalion to higher command elements responsible for the sector. Air assets were not immediately available. Apaches were tasked elsewhere. Fast movers required clearance. Time stretched. Seconds became decisions. Decisions became losses. The perimeter began to collapse in sections. Observation post topside, position higher up, took the worst of it. Isolated. Outnumbered. Cut off. From immediate reinforcement. They had chosen that ground. Or more precisely, they had accepted it. The assumption had been repeated before they ever landed. Remote, yes. Exposed, maybe. But manageable. It always sounded manageable on a map. By mid-morning, the outpost was no longer a position. It was a series of disconnected survival points. And the men holding them were no longer thinking about strategy. They were thinking about angles. About ammunition. About how much time was left before the next volley landed exactly where they were already standing. They had everything. Air support on call. ISR platforms in theater. A chain of command extending back to Bagram Airfield. They still couldn't hold the ground beneath their feet. They had already rehearsed the logic. Insert. Establish. Expand. That was the sequence. It had worked in other valleys. Kinner. Karangal. Pesh River. You insert a platoon-sized element, secure a foothold, build local presence, disrupt insurgent movement, and extend influence outward through patrols and Afghan National Army integration. It looked coherent on a briefing slide. From above, it always did. By the time Alpha Company elements moved into the Waygal Valley, the system behind them was fully engaged. Battalion Command at Forward Operating Base Blessing was tracking the operation. Higher command elements under Combined Task Force 101 had already approved the expansion into Wanat. Intelligence summaries suggested insurgent presence, but not concentration. Activity, but not mass. The pattern had been observed before. Harassment. IEDs. Small unit contact. Manageable. So they moved. The insertion wasn't rushed. 47 Chinooks lifted the troops in, heavy with gear, ammunition, construction materials. The landing zone had been selected based on proximity to the village and the river. Flat ground. Accessible. Exposed. But accessible. Within hours, the soldiers of 2-503RD began constructing what would become Vehicle Patrol Base Kahler. HESCO barriers were unloaded but not fully placed. Fighting positions were scraped into the ground with limited tools. The terrain was unforgiving, rocky soil, uneven grading, minimal natural cover. Every minute spent digging was a minute exposed. Still, the timeline held. The assumption remained intact. They would have time. Above them, observation post topside was established to provide overwatch. A small element positioned higher on the slope, intended to dominate the surrounding terrain and provide early warning. In theory, it extended the defensive envelope. In practice, it extended the perimeter beyond what could be supported. The gap between the VPB and OP topside was not just distance. It was time. Reinforcement required movement under observation, across exposed ground, under fire. But the structure had been approved. Requests for additional assets had been processed through the chain. Engineers were limited. Air support was prioritized across multiple engagements in eastern Afghanistan. ISR coverage rotated based on broader operational needs. No single location was ever the priority. That was the system. And the system did not fail all at once. It degraded. The first patrols out of Wanat met resistance, but nothing decisive. Small arms fire from distance. Fighters withdrawing before engagement could be fixed. No sustained contact. No clear massing of forces. It reinforced the assumption. They were watching, but not preparing. Signals intelligence collected by higher-level assets, including Task Force Orange, intercepted fragments of communication, movement, coordination, but the volume was low, intermittent, difficult to localize in terrain that absorbed signals and distorted direction finding. Human intelligence was thinner. The valley was not secured. Local networks were unreliable. Allegiances shifted based on proximity and pressure. Information flowed, but it was filtered. What reached the Americans was incomplete. And incomplete data has a way of confirming what you already believe. Construction continued. Daylight hours were spent improving the position. Night operations were limited. Fatigue accumulated. Security rotations stretched thin. The number of available rifles did not change, but the demands on them did. OP topside reported occasional movement. Shadows. Figures at distance. Nothing that justified escalation. Nothing that triggered a reevaluation of the plan. The rules were clear. Avoid unnecessary escalation. Maintain presence. Build relationships. The doctrine emphasized control through stability. But stability requires control. And control requires dominance of terrain. They had neither. Still, reports moved upward through the chain. Platoon leaders to company command. Company to battalion. Battalions to brigade. Each layer adding context, filtering urgency, aligning information with operational expectations. No one ignored the risk. They just measured it differently. By the evening before the attack, the outpost was still incomplete. Fighting positions lacked overhead cover. Fields of fire were partially obstructed. Defensive sectors overlapped inconsistently. Heavy weapons positions were not fully optimized. But the timeline remained unchanged. They would continue construction. They would hold. They would expand. The night passed without incident. That was the final confirmation. No probing attack. No indirect fire. No escalation. Silence. It suggested hesitation. It suggested weakness. It suggested the enemy was not ready. So the system held its assumptions. Morning would be another work cycle. Another day to improve the position. Another day to close the gaps. But the gaps were already known. Not by the men inside the perimeter. By the men watching from above. They had studied the rhythm. They had mapped the positions. They had counted the guns. And they had waited. Not because they lacked capability. Because they understood timing. When the first rounds came in, it wasn't a reaction. It was execution. And everything the Americans had built over the previous 24 hours, every decision, every delay, every assumption, was already part of the enemy's plan. The problem was not the attack. The problem was the ground. Everything else followed from that. They believed they were establishing presence. A foothold that could be reinforced, expanded, stabilized over time. That assumption had worked elsewhere because the terrain allowed it. Valleys with manageable elevation. Villages that could be observed without being dominated. Routes that could be controlled without being seen from every direction at once. Wanat was different. The valley narrowed as it moved north. Steep, forested slopes rising sharply on both sides, climbing hundreds of meters above the riverbed. The village itself sat along a natural corridor, but the surrounding terrain was layered. Terraces, compounds, tree lines, folds in the ground that broke line of sight every 20 to 30 meters. From above, it looked like complexity. From the ground, it was fragmentation. The position selected for Vehicle Patrol Base Kahler was not chosen because it was defensible. It was chosen because it was accessible. That distinction mattered more than anyone admitted. The CH-47 Chinooks needed a landing zone. Flat enough. Open enough, within range of the village, within logistical reach of the supply chain running back to FOB Blessing. The river provided orientation. The road, such as it was, provided justification. But accessibility is not dominance. And dominance is the only thing that matters when you are surrounded by higher ground. Observation post topside was intended to compensate for that. A small element placed above the main position, tasked with early warning and overwatch. In doctrine, it extended the defensive envelope. In reality, it split it. The distance between the VPB and OP topside was approximately 75 to 100 meters horizontally, but the elevation difference turned it into a vertical separation that couldn't be quickly bridged under fire. Movement between the two required exposure along a slope that was visible from multiple enemy vantage points. Reinforcement was not immediate. It was conditional. And in combat, conditional support is the same as absence. The assumption had been simple. If the enemy attacks, they will probe. If they probe, they will reveal themselves. If they reveal themselves, air support and indirect fires will neutralize them. That sequence depended on time. Time to detect. Time to react. Time to escalate. But the enemy did not follow that sequence. They bypassed it. Taliban fighters in the Waygal Valley were not operating as isolated cells. They were organized at a local level, reinforced by external fighters who understood the terrain. They had spent weeks observing the insertion patterns, the construction rhythm, the guard rotations. They didn't need satellites. They had line of sight. They didn't need signals intelligence. They had proximity. While Task Force Orange intercepted fragments of communication at higher altitudes, the fighters on the ground used couriers, short-range radios, and prearranged signals. Communication that never entered the systems designed to detect it. What looked like low activity was not absence. It was discipline. The Americans measured threat through indicators, intercepts, contact reports, movement patterns. But the valley absorbed those indicators. It hid mass. It compressed movement. It allowed fighters to assemble within 300 meters of the objective without triggering early detection. The system saw what it was designed to see and missed what it wasn't. Even the structure of command contributed to the delay in understanding. At the platoon level, concerns existed. The ground was exposed. Fields of fire were incomplete. OP topside felt isolated. But those concerns moved upward through a hierarchy that translated them into manageable risk. Company command evaluated based on available assets. Battalion command balanced Wanat against other operational priorities across Nuristan and Kunar. Brigade command viewed it as one node in a broader counterinsurgency strategy. At each level, the problem became smaller, more abstract, less immediate. No one denied the risk. They just distributed it. And distributed risk rarely feels urgent. The timeline reinforced the illusion. Less than 24 hours on the ground. No significant contact overnight. No escalation during construction. Patrols meeting only light resistance. Each data point aligned with the assumption that the enemy was present, but not prepared. But preparation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for completion. The Taliban did not need to disrupt the construction phase. They needed it to continue. Every unfinished fighting position was a known weakness. Every HESCO barrier not yet filled was a gap. Every weapon system not yet in-placed was a delay in response. They allowed the Americans to build just enough to commit, but not enough to survive. The geometry of the battlefield was already fixed before the first shot. High ground controlled by the enemy. Fields of fire restricted by terrain and incomplete construction. Observation limited by elevation and vegetation. Reinforcement constrained by exposure and distance. Air support dependent on availability and clearance. It was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of alignment. The method did not match the environment. They applied a template designed for one type of valley to a terrain that rejected it. And the system supported that decision because the system was built on repetition. What had worked before was expected to work again, until it didn't. By the time the attack began, there were no unknowns left for the enemy. Only execution. And for the Americans, there were no remaining adjustments to make. Only reactions. The outcome was not decided in the firefight. It was decided when accessibility was mistaken for control. When presence was mistaken for dominance. When silence was mistaken for absence. They had built a position inside a battlefield they did not control. And the battlefield had been waiting. The shift did not begin in Wanat. It began years earlier, in valleys where the ground looked similar, but behaved differently. Units like the 75th Ranger Regiment had learned it first, operating in smaller, more controlled environments. JSOC elements, including Delta Force and the CIA's Special Activities Division, had already adjusted their methods in Iraq, moving away from visible presence toward targeted, intelligence-driven operations. But Afghanistan resisted that transition. The terrain punished visibility. The culture rejected speed. And yet the doctrine remained anchored to expansion. Hold, build, extend. Wanat exposed the limits of that thinking, but the alternative had already been forming in quieter places. The Special Air Service had approached similar terrain with a different assumption. Not that presence creates control, but that visibility invites targeting. SAS squadrons operating under Task Force Helmand had spent years building human networks in areas where maps meant very little. They moved in four-man patrols, sometimes 6, inserted at night by CH-47 Chinooks, often landing kilometers away from their actual observation points. They did not build positions. They occupied terrain temporarily. Ridges, tree lines, compounds. Then they disappeared. Their priority was not to be seen. It was to see. Human intelligence came first. Local intermediaries, tribal connections, informants cultivated over time. Not reliable in the traditional sense, but layered, cross-checked, filtered through experience. Signals intelligence supported it, but did not lead. Task Force Orange could intercept communications, but the SAS understood that most meaningful decisions in these valleys were never transmitted electronically. They were carried, spoken, agreed upon in rooms without radios. So they adapted. Instead of establishing fixed patrol bases in exposed positions, they created patterns that were harder to define. Temporary overwatch sites, rotating observation points, limited duration presence that denied the enemy a fixed target. They controlled the ground by refusing to anchor to it. The difference was not tactical. It was philosophical. In Wanat, the assumption was that presence would disrupt the enemy. In Helmand, the understanding was that presence would attract him. That distinction shaped everything, even the way they used force. When SAS patrols identified enemy movement, they did not immediately engage unless the conditions were controlled. They tracked, observed, built a picture over hours, sometimes days. When they acted, it was precise, coordinated with assets already positioned for immediate response. Apaches on standby, ISR already focused, quick reaction forces pre-briefed. No delays, no requests moving up through multiple layers during contact. The decision loop was compressed. At Wanat, the loop expanded under pressure. Requests for close air support moved from platoon to company, from company to battalion, then to higher command elements responsible for air tasking. Each layer required confirmation, deconfliction, prioritization. Time was lost, not because anyone hesitated, because the system required it. The SAS reduced that dependency by operating within a smaller, more autonomous framework. Authority delegated downward. Patrol commanders making decisions based on immediate conditions, not waiting for distant approval unless escalation required it. They operated inside the timeline, not behind it. The Israelis had reached a similar conclusion through a different path. Sayeret Matkal, operating in complex environments with high civilian density, had learned that control comes from understanding patterns, not imposing structure. Their operations focused on identifying key individuals, mapping relationships, and acting surgically. They did not attempt to dominate entire areas at once. They isolated variables, then removed them. Wanat was built on a different model, one that required visibility, required construction, required time. But time is a luxury you do not control in contested terrain. The Taliban understood that. They allowed the Americans to operate within their own doctrine. They allowed them to build, to establish, to expose. Because a fixed position simplifies the problem. It creates coordinates. It creates predictability. And predictability can be studied. The alternative doctrine rejected that entirely. No fixed patterns. No predictable routines. No positions that could be mapped and rehearsed against. Even logistics adapted to this mindset. Instead of large, visible resupply operations, smaller units relied on staggered insertion, cached equipment, minimal footprint. Sustainment became part of the operational design, not a separate function. Everything reduced signature. Everything reduced predictability. The goal was not to eliminate risk. It was to control how risk appeared. At Wanat, risk was visible, measurable, documented in reports. But visibility did not translate to control. It translated to exposure. The system had built a position that could be analyzed from every angle. The alternative would have been harder to see, harder to define, harder to attack. But it required abandoning the idea that control comes from staying. Sometimes control comes from not being there when the enemy expects you. And that is not something a fixed outpost can ever achieve. The first minute decided the tempo, not the outcome that had already been set, but the tempo, how fast it would collapse, how long it could be held. That was decided in the opening volleys. At 4:20 local time, the valley was still holding the last of the night's cold. Temperatures hovered just above freezing. Breath visible, hands stiff, weapons metal cold to the touch. Then the tree line erupted. PKM fire from the eastern ridge cut across the unfinished northern fighting positions. Simultaneously, RPG, 7 rounds impacted along the southern perimeter, walking inward with deliberate spacing, 5 to 7 seconds between impacts, adjusted after each explosion. This was not suppression. It was calibration. Within the first 3 minutes, observation post topside was fully engaged. Approximately 9 U.S. soldiers positioned along a narrow slope, shallow fighting positions, limited overhead cover. Their M240B machine gun opened up toward the ridgeline, but the angle was wrong. The enemy was not cresting. They were firing from defilade. Rounds came in from positions slightly below the ridgeline, masked by vegetation, using the slope itself as cover. Return fire hit trees. The enemy adjusted again. AK-47 fire began to flank the OP from the north, forcing the element to split its attention. The radio traffic from topside became fragmented. Contact reports overlapping. Requests for ammunition already coming through. Down at the VPB, the situation was worse. Alpha Company's perimeter was not continuous. Fighting positions were still being connected by shallow trenches. Some sectors had overlapping fire. Others had gaps of 20 to 30 meters with no direct line of sight between positions. The Taliban moved into those gaps, not rushing, advancing in short bounds, using irrigation ditches, low stone walls, and the folds of the terrain. Distances closed to under 200 meters within the first 10 minutes. Staff Sergeant Ty Carter moved between positions, carrying 5.56 millimeters ammunition drums, exposing himself repeatedly across open ground that had already been registered by enemy fire. Each movement was calculated in seconds. 3 seconds to cross. 5 seconds if the firing shifted. He moved anyway. At the western edge of the perimeter, a crew-served M240B attempted to establish a base of fire toward a compound cluster approximately 150 meters out. The gunner fired in controlled bursts, but the position lacked proper sandbag reinforcement. Each recoil shifted the weapon slightly, degrading accuracy. Then an RPG impacted within meters of the gun pit. The assistant gunner was hit. The weapon went silent for 11 seconds. 11 seconds was enough. Enemy fighters advanced another 30 meters. Inside the command post, radio operators were attempting to establish clear communication with battalion. The call for troops in contact had already been sent, but now it required detail. Grid coordinates, enemy strength, direction of attack. But direction was no longer singular. It was 360 degrees. The platoon leader's voice cut through intermittently, trying to impose structure on a situation that had already outpaced it. Requests for close air support were transmitted up through company command, relayed to battalion at FOB Blessing, then pushed to the Brigade Air Support Operations Center. Airspace was contested by priority, not urgency. Apaches from the 101st Combat Aviation Brigade were tasked elsewhere. The nearest AH-64 flight required time to retask, rearm, and move. Fast movers, F-15E Strike Eagles, were on call, but required positive identification and clearance due to proximity of friendly forces and the density of the engagement. Everything required confirmation. Time moved differently on the radio. At OP topside, Specialist Gunnar Zwilling was already down. Others were wounded. The position was partially overrun on its northern edge. Taliban fighters had closed to within grenade range, under 50 meters. Hand grenades were thrown uphill. The Americans responded in kind. Explosions at that distance are not dramatic. They are concussive. Dirt. Fragmentation. Silence for half a second. Then more gunfire. A request was made to reinforce topside. It was denied at the moment it was considered. Not formally. Physically. Movement from the VPB to the OP required crossing open ground that was now under direct observation from at least 3 enemy firing points. Any element attempting to move uphill would be exposed for approximately 20 to 30 seconds with no cover. No one could survive that movement under current fire conditions. So topside was left to hold. Not by decision, by reality. Back at the VPB, the mortar pit attempted to respond. A 60mm tube, hastily positioned, limited range due to elevation constraints. The first rounds were fired towards suspected enemy positions along the eastern slope. The rounds impacted high. The angle was wrong. Adjustments were made, but each adjustment required exposure. Crew members rising slightly to observe, to correct. Enemy fire began to target the mortar pit specifically. It went silent after the third adjustment. The Taliban continued to close. By 5 o'clock, multiple fighters had reached positions within 100 meters of the perimeter. Some occupied abandoned or partially constructed fighting positions that had not yet been integrated into the defensive plan. They were now using American positions against American forces. Inside the perimeter, ammunition redistribution became critical. Soldiers moved under fire, passing magazines, linking belts for machine guns, pulling wounded into whatever cover existed. Medical evacuation was requested. Denied by conditions. No landing zone was secure. No helicopter could approach without being engaged from elevated positions. The valley had become a kill box. At 5:30, the first air asset checked in. An MQ-1 Predator drone already in theater was redirected over Wanat. Its sensors provided real-time imagery, but resolution was limited by terrain and vegetation. Heat signatures overlapped. Identification was uncertain. Task Force Orange attempted to integrate signals intercepts, but the enemy's communications remained minimal, localized, often non-electronic. The picture was incomplete. Still, by 6 o'clock, the first AH-64 Apache pair was inbound. Their arrival changed the sound of the battlefield before it changed anything else. The distinct rotor signature cut through the chaos. For a moment, it suggested control. Then they entered the valley. Immediately, they were engaged. Heavy machine gun fire from elevated positions forced them to adjust altitude and angle of attack. Hellfire missiles required clear identification and separation from friendly positions. That separation barely existed. The pilots had seconds to decide. They fired. Hellfires impacted along the eastern ridge, detonations echoing through the valley, displacing some enemy positions. But not enough. The Taliban had already distributed their forces. Small groups. Multiple firing points. No single target that would collapse the attack. Back on the ground, the perimeter was no longer intact. It was a series of contested positions. Some held, some partially overrun. At least one was lost entirely for several minutes before being retaken in close quarters fighting. Distances had collapsed to under 30 meters in certain sectors. At that range, there is no maneuver, only reaction, only survival. The system above them was still moving. Requests. Approvals. Assets being redirected. But on the ground, the fight had already compressed into something else. Something smaller. Faster. More final. They were no longer defending a position. They were holding fragments of it. And every fragment was under pressure. By 7:30, the fight had lost its shape. Not ended. Just reduced. The Taliban assault, which had begun as a coordinated, multi-axis attack, started to fragment under sustained resistance and the gradual arrival of air support. Apache gun runs became more aggressive as pilots adjusted to the terrain, firing 30mm bursts into tree lines where movement was confirmed. F-15E Strike Eagles checked in overhead, releasing precision-guided munitions on pre-cleared targets along the eastern ridges. The valley absorbed the explosions the same way it absorbed everything else. Partially, never completely. On the ground, the American position still held, but not as it had been designed. Observation post topside was no longer an observation post. It was a survival pocket. Of the 9 soldiers originally positioned there, several were dead or critically wounded. The remaining defenders had consolidated into a reduced perimeter, weapons redistributed, fields of fire narrowed to what they could physically see within 20 to 40 meters. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Their radios still worked. Barely. Requests for extraction were transmitted, acknowledged, then deferred. There was still no viable route. No helicopter could land. No ground element could reach them without crossing exposed terrain under intermittent, but still effective, enemy fire. So they remained. Not because the system chose it, because the terrain enforced it. At the VPB, Alpha Company had stabilized sections of the perimeter, but at a cost that was no longer abstract. Multiple positions were marked not by sandbags or HESCO barriers, but by the absence of return fire. Casualties had been pulled inward, stacked in whatever cover existed. Tourniquets applied. Morphine administered. Time was measured differently now. Not in minutes. In bleeding. By 8 o'clock, the Taliban began to disengage. Not abruptly. Deliberately. Firing became intermittent. Then selective. Then distant. They did not collapse. They withdrew. Small groups peeling back into the same terrain that had allowed them to assemble undetected. Tree lines swallowed them. Compounds concealed them. The ridgelines that had once amplified their fire now erased their movement. There was no pursuit. There couldn't be. The Americans did not control the ground beyond their immediate positions. And even those positions were temporary. By mid-morning, the battlefield was quiet. Not silent. Residual shots echoed from distant slopes. Occasional movement triggered isolated engagements. But the coordinated assault was over. The system above them finally caught up to the reality below. Medical evacuation was cleared. The first medevac helicopters approached cautiously, escorted by Apaches flying low and aggressive, suppressing any potential firing points along the approach corridors. Dust kicked up across the valley floor as the aircraft touched down in hastily secured zones. Loading the wounded took time. Too much time. Each movement exposed the helicopters. Each delay increased risk. But there was no alternative. The dead remained. The wounded were prioritized. The living continued to hold security. By early afternoon, reinforcements began to arrive. Elements from other units, redirected from nearby operations, inserted into the valley to stabilize the position. They brought additional firepower, more ammunition, more structure. But structure comes after the moment, not during it. By the time control was reestablished, the fight had already decided what it would cost. 9 U.S. soldiers were dead, dozens wounded. Observation post topside had been nearly overrun. The main perimeter had been breached in multiple locations. And the position they had been ordered to build, the foothold they were meant to expand, no longer made sense. Within days, the decision was made. Vehicle Patrol Base Kahler would be abandoned, not because it couldn't be rebuilt, but because holding it required accepting the same conditions that had nearly destroyed it. The ground had not changed. The geometry remained. High ground still dominated the valley. Approach routes were still exposed. Observations still favored the enemy. Leaving was not a retreat. It was a correction. But corrections that come after loss are not strategic. They are consequential. The Taliban did not hold the ground after the battle. They didn't need to. They had already achieved what mattered. They had demonstrated that the position could be attacked, that it could be penetrated, that it could not be sustained without disproportionate cost. And in that valley, perception was control. The Americans had air power. They had reinforcement. They had the ability to return. But they did not have dominance. And without dominance, presence becomes temporary. By the time the last elements withdrew from Wanat, the valley returned to what it had been before. Controlled by terrain. Observed by those who lived within it. Resistant to anything that tried to fix itself in place. The outpost was gone. The ground remained. And the lesson was already there, long before anyone wrote it down. What changed after Wanat was not immediate. Systems like this do not pivot overnight. They absorb. They document. They reinterpret. And then, slowly, they adjust the language before they adjust the behavior. Official reviews would later examine terrain analysis, intelligence gaps, command decisions. Reports would move through battalion, brigade, and higher. Recommendations would be written in precise language, structured, controlled. But the ground had already delivered its own conclusion. It had done it in less than 6 hours. The assumption that presence creates control began to fracture. Not publicly, not doctrinally at first, but operationally. Units rotating into eastern Afghanistan after Wanat approached similar terrain with a different awareness. Platoon leaders questioned landing zones more aggressively. Company commanders pushed harder on terrain dominance before committing to construction. Requests for engineer support, for ISR prioritization, for overwatch positions. These were no longer procedural. They became conditions. If those conditions were not met, the timeline shifted. Or the mission did. Not always, but more often than before. The change was subtle. It had to be, because the system could not admit that the method itself had been misaligned. So it adjusted the edges. more emphasis on terrain analysis, more caution in establishing fixed positions in constricted valleys, greater integration of ISR before insertion. But ISR itself was also reevaluated because Wanat had shown its limits. Predator feeds, satellite imagery, signals intercepts, they provided a picture, but not the picture that mattered. The fighters who attacked Wanat had not revealed themselves through detectable patterns. They had moved within the terrain, within civilian structures, within a communication network that did not rely on signals that could be intercepted. So the shift moved towards something less visible. Human intelligence. Not in theory. In necessity. Efforts to build local networks became more deliberate, but also more cautious. Trust was no longer assumed to grow from presence alone. It required time, consistency, a reduced footprint. Large, visible outposts became less attractive in certain areas. Not because they couldn't be defended, but because defending them required accepting a constant exposure that the terrain amplified. Instead, smaller elements began to operate with more fluidity. Temporary positions, short-duration presence, patrol patterns that avoided predictability. It was not a full adoption of the methods used by units like the SAS or Sayeret Makal, but it moved in that direction, less about holding ground, more about understanding it. The chain of command also adapted, though more quietly. At Wanat, decision-making had expanded under pressure, requests moving upward, approvals moving downward, time lost between layers. After Wanat, there was a gradual recognition that some decisions could not wait for that cycle. Authority began to compress, not formally rewritten in doctrine, but practiced. On the ground, platoon leaders and company commanders exercised more immediate control over fires and maneuver when conditions deteriorated. Pre-authorization for certain responses became more common. Air support coordination improved, not by increasing availability, but by aligning expectations earlier. The goal was not faster reaction. It was reduced delay. Because delay, in that terrain, was not neutral. It was decisive. The idea of the key terrain also shifted. Before Wanat, key terrain was often defined by proximity to population centers, supply routes, or areas of influence. After Wanat, elevation and observation began to dominate that definition more consistently. If you could not control the high ground, you did not control the area. If you could not observe beyond your perimeter was already compromised. This was not new knowledge. It had always been true. But Wanat forced it back into priority. At the institutional level, the lesson was absorbed into training cycles, pre-deployment briefs, terrain analysis models. But the deeper change was quieter. It was psychological. The belief that overwhelming capability, air power, ISR, rapid reinforcement, could compensate for positional disadvantage weakened. Not removed, but questioned. Because Wanat had shown that capability arrives on a timeline, and the battlefield does not wait for it. Power, in that environment, was not defined by what you could bring. It was defined by what you already controlled when the first shot was fired. The Taliban did not win Wanat in a conventional sense. They did not hold the ground. They did not destroy the unit. But they exposed a boundary, a limit to how far a system could extend itself into terrain it did not dominate. And once that boundary is visible, it cannot be unseen. Subsequent operations carried that awareness, even when it wasn't spoken. Positions were questioned. Assumptions tested. Silence interpreted differently. Because silence had been the final confirmation before the attack. And confirmation, it turned out, had been the most dangerous signal of all. They had everything. Air support, intelligence, numbers, structure. But none of it mattered in the first minutes. Because in those minutes, the only thing that existed was ground. Who held it? Who observed it? Who understood it? Everything else arrived later. And later, in that valley, was already too late.